Which brings us to motion number 3 on sanctions. I call the Minister to move the motion.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that the House has approved the Iran Sanctions Amendment Regulations 2024. These regulations amend the Iran Sanctions Regulations 2023. And the instrument was laid before Parliament on the 12th of September under powers contained in the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018, and the measures entered into force the following day. Madam Deputy Speaker, as the Minister responsible for sanctions, I would like to start by setting out the Government's priorities in this area. Since coming into office, I've been clear that we must have the necessary powers and tools to implement and enforce our sanctions regimes effectively. The proper implementation and enforcement of UK sanctions is critical to maximising their impact, and this government is committed to improving the UK's track record on sanctions enforcement, and that is why on the 10th of October we launched the Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation, OTSI, which enhanced civil enforcement powers to maximise the impact of the UK's trade sanctions. These powers include the ability to issue civil monetary penalties for sanctions breaches and for OTSI to make details of breaches public. There are also new reporting requirements on sectors well positioned to find evidence of trade sanctions breaches. We have put in place similar civil enforcement powers for transport sanctions too, aligning the enforcement of trade and transport sanctions with our approach to financial sanctions. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have also brought together ministerial colleagues on sanctions enforcement, and with colleagues in the Treasury, Home Office, Department for Business and Trade, Department for Transport and the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, we are working towards a shared vision of how to enhance our sanctions enforcement, and this will include ways in which we can further support our UK overseas territories and Crown dependencies with their sanctions enforcement. And we plan to be transparent on what we're doing, and I look forward to updating Parliament on enforcement actions in due course. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government has also deployed sanctions in innovative and impactful ways, including in this sanctions package that we're putting forward today. We have taken swift and decisive action to increase pressure on Russia's war machine, spearheading a call to action to tackle Russia's shadow fleet at the EPC in July. We've sanctioned 43 oil tankers which were transporting Russian oil. We have also sanctioned 9 LNG vessels involved in the shipping of Russian LNG, including from Russia's flagship Arctic LNG 2 project, targeting the Kremlin's energy revenues. But we have also enhanced our response to the threat from the Iranian regime, and I will now turn to the details of this instrument, Madam Deputy Speaker. This instrument contains measures to deter the government of Iran from causing regional and international instability by disrupting its unmanned aerial vehicles and missile industries and its access to items that are critical for military development, and I hope the House will support these important measures today. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Iranian regime's development and proliferation of large volumes of advanced conventional weapons, including UAVs and missiles, continues to destabilise the Middle East and also prolongs Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. Iran's use of an unprecedented number of UAVs and missiles during their attack on Israel on the 13th of April 2024 demonstrated how Iranian weapons development and proliferation is fuelling conflict and escalation in the Middle East. And indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Iranian regime also used hundreds of these arms in their attack against Israel on the 1st of October, which we condemn in the strongest terms. This attack once more endangered the lives of innocent civilians and escalated an already incredibly dangerous situation, and it cannot be tolerated. In response to Iran's 1st of October attack on Israel, the UK has designated 9 individuals and entities involved in facilitating Iran's destabilising activity, and this includes senior military figures and the Iranian Space Agency, which develops technologies that have applications in ballistic missile development. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are deeply concerned about the prospect for further escalation, and all efforts must now be on breaking the cycle of violence. At this moment, when tensions are at their peak, calm heads must prevail and all sides must take immediate steps to de-escalate. A regional war is, of course, in no one's interest. But this is the latest in the long history of Iran destabilising the region, including through its political, financial and military support for its proxies and partners, such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis and its aligned militia groups in Iraq and Syria. And we have been clear and consistent that Iran must cease this support. I will happily give way.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way and his generosity in doing so. Would he accept that actually a key component of that destabilisation that you see being sponsored by the Iranian regime is done by the IRGC? And I wondered if during his speech he would be able to update the House as to where the government's thinking was in terms of prescribing this organisation, which I think he'd find many allies across the House who would be keen to see that happen.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments. We, of course, recognise the huge threat that the IRGC poses, and we will take the necessary measures to counter it at home and around the world. He will understand that the government keeps the list of prescribed terrorist organisations under careful review, and we don't, of course, comment in the House on whether an organisation may be under consideration. As I said, Iran is also now one of Russia's top military backers and has supplied Russia with hundreds of UAVs since 2022, including different models of drones. And Russia has used these to target Ukraine's critical infrastructure and to kill innocent civilians, prolonging the suffering of the Ukrainian people. In September, Iran also supplied Russia with hundreds of close-range ballistic missiles. This is a further escalation of Iran's military support to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and will further enable Russia's invasion. In return, Iran is receiving Russian military and technological support, enabling them to further develop their military capabilities and enhancing the risk they pose to the region and beyond. Madam Deputy Speaker, this legislation expands the UK's trade sanctions against Iran with the aim of disrupting its UAV and missile industry and its access to items critical to military development. It includes sanctions in relation to the items from the Russia Common High Priority list, and this list was jointly agreed by the UK, EU, US and Japan in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, and it identifies items that Russia is using in its weapon systems, ranging from semiconductors to machine tools. These items, Madam Deputy Speaker, are also significant in Iran's production of advanced conventional weapons. And as the House will know, there have been many public reports around Iran's supply of weapons to Russia, and we are therefore prohibiting the export, supply, delivery and making available of these items to Iran through the measures in this instrument. We are also prohibiting the provision of ancillary services associated with the goods, such as brokering services, technical assistance, financial services and funds. All of the items prohibited by our partners in the EU in May have also been prohibited by this instrument. But in addition, prohibitions will also be applied to some items identified by the Ministry of Defence as significant to Iran's UAV and missile industries. We've also taken this opportunity to simplify some of the existing trade sanctions on Iran so that businesses are better able to implement them. These trade restrictions complement our existing export controls and sanctions, ensuring that no UK business or person, wherever they are in the world, can facilitate the export, transfer, supply, delivery and making available of these items to Iran without prior authorisation. I hope that these measures will receive the support of the House, and I commend them to the House. I'm sure there will be opportunity for him to make a speech in due course. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The question is, as on the order paper, can I just remind members, please, if you're intending to speak in a debate, you need to be here for the opening statements. It is a particular discourtesy to the House if the front bench spokespersons are not here at the beginning. Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Conservative Party supports these regulations to extend the Iran sanctions regime to drones and drone technology, as well as financial services, funds, brokering services relating to other items of strategic concern. But these sanctions seek to address issues emblematic of a far larger threat. The government should be in no doubt Iran's malign influence is one of the biggest challenges to both global and British security. Iran has for decades deliberately undermined the rules-based international order, destabilising their neighbourhood and funding terrorism globally, all while brutally repressing its own people and committing a femicide. For years, the Iranian regime has created asymmetric threats, co-opted existing movements and provided weapons, money and training to its proxies and ideological partners, be it Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, or Shia militias and the popular mobilisation forces across Iraq and Syria. Terrorist organisations who have no interest in those of their local people and who instead pursue the aims of the Ayatollah. Hostage captors and committers of the worst atrocity against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. act as disrupting maritime traffic in the Red Sea, a sea lane absolutely vital for delivery of food and fertiliser to countries facing serious hunger crises in East Africa and South Asia. Now, Iran, as my honourable friend set out, is embedding itself in conflict on our own continent, transferring hundreds of attack drones and, as we now know, ballistic missiles to Russia to prop up its barbaric and illegal, unprovoked, renewed invasion of Ukraine. They are fuelling a war machine which seeks to dismantle a sovereign democratic state in Europe and enabling the murder of Ukrainians every single day. The government must now allow Ukraine's use of long-range weaponry on strategic targets. Escalation warrants a response, or further deterrence will be undermined. And the invasion of Ukraine is an attack on us all. Iran is that hand in glove for Russia with the perpetrators. Here at home, there have been numerous Iranian plots to assassinate British or UK-based individuals who the regime considers their enemies. The UK has had to respond to more than 15 of these since 2022. We have seen Iranian cutouts investigated for spreading IRGC propaganda and glorifying sanctioned individuals and terrorists. We have seen IRGC generals providing radicalising lectures here in our capital city. And even on our streets, we have seen people glorifying organisations such as the Houthis and others, who are not acting in defence of Gaza. They are not progressive movements, they are terrorists. Iran has also arbitrarily detained and imprisoned British citizens, including Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, whose shocking ordeal proves beyond doubt Iran's disdain for human rights and human dignity. As the Conservative government demonstrated, you can take a muscular approach. We introduced the extensive sanctions regime to disrupt Iran's hostile behaviour, targeting its decision-makers along with those who did their bidding. We imposed measures to help choke off the funding flows from Iran to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as sanctions on Iran's drone programme. Indeed, 400 sanctions were in place on Iran by the time we left office, and in 2023 alone we made 154 new designations. Alongside the US and with support from allies, we carried out strikes against the Houthis in Yemen to degrade their capabilities, aiding and supporting allies across the world. British military personnel and equipment helped defend Israel from Iranian attack in April, and we told the regime in Tehran in no uncertain terms that it must rein in its proxies. When the government proposes measures to counter Iran's appalling behaviour like those regulations before the House today, we will support them. But we will also be very clear that the government needs to maintain the pressure and look at the bigger picture in equal measure to respond to the ever-growing threat. And that takes me, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the strategy that we are pursuing. We must stop compartmentalising our response and our approach to Iran. We need to work out how we are going to measure success when it comes from reducing the threat of Iran to our people and our interests, and the government must do this work. Iran does not currently pursue active and direct confrontation with us, but their threshold for chaos is too high, and we must work out how we reduce that threat. Iran will continue to do as it sees fit. Its priority is the survival of the regime, and it has strategic patience. But we need to shape a strategy not in response to Iran, but in the pursuit of our ambitions, protecting our people and our interests. And we cannot, unfortunately, rely on the USA to lead. We need a new Euro-Atlantic focus on this, but the UK must decide what for us is our priorities. We must also be prepared because there are fractures within the regime. We must recognise that whilst Iran rarely changes its behaviour, it does have a cycle of boom and bust, and we must be prepared for what may fall out. So I urge the Minister today to take that opportunity to restructure, and I recognise that he's the Minister for Sanctions rather than Minister of North Africa, but I know he will take these words back. It is time for us to rethink our strategy on Iran, moving from reactive to proactive. We need to see long-term thinking also on how we restore state control over areas abused by Iranian-backed non-state actors. This includes the implementation of UN Resolution 1701 and the removal of Hezbollah military positions from southern Lebanon, with the Lebanese military being able to reassert sovereign control. We also need to see a strategic approach to the Houthis which prioritises the restoration of proper governance in Yemen, including payment of public servants and protections against Houthi embezzlement of public funds. Domestically, we must bolster our resilience and protect our society from corrosive Iranian influence and transnational repression, which is extensive. The National Security Act should be implemented in full as quickly as possible, including the Register of Foreign Lobbyists, which shamefully the government has currently delayed, and I urge them to put it in place as soon as possible. There is no reason for it not to be pursuing to proceed at speed. Internationally, we must work with our partners to contain the looming threat of a nuclear Iran. The JCPOA needs revisiting, and there is no perfect deal, but the current situation is untenable. The JCPOA is on life support. We need that new Euro-Atlantic approach that I mentioned, and Anthony Blinken's comment that Iran's nuclear breakout time is now 1 to 2 weeks should concern us all. They are a nuclear threshold state. We have the agency to disrupt Iran's malign plans and to lead the international community in doing so if we have the courage to act and are prepared to develop a harder edge. And the time to act must be now. Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, I would be grateful if the Minister could answer the following questions. When will the government prescribe the IRGC? Because that was a promise made when they were in opposition, and promises matter. Secondly, will he work with allies to ensure these sanctions are international and ensure their effectiveness in curbing Iranian drone development exports? Individual sanctions programmes do not work. They must be done within a multilateral basis. Will he also work to ensure that OFSI is pursuing penalties against those who breach sanctions? Because we have not seen any pursued on where we have seen breaches of sanctions around Russia, and we must see them here in both Iran and Russia. Does he agree that in addition to sanctions, we must also buttress Ukraine's military capability requirements so they can take down Iranian drones in the skies and match the weapon range of Russia's armed forces? And that means the use of Storm Shadow missiles. Finally, with proxies like Hezbollah being degraded, will he commit to working towards freeing captured societies from Iranian influence and helping states such as Lebanon reassert their independence and state effectiveness? And will he assert in clear terms that the government condemns all Iranian proxies and will assist good faith actors in resisting their proliferation, political entrenchment, military expansion, and pursue a new UK coherent strategy to protect our people, our country and our interests from an increasingly belligerent Iran? The government's message to Iran at all times must be that their threshold for chaos is too high. They must step back, and their current approach is not working. But that starts with us recognising that we can be in the driving seat and stop reacting to Iran. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Nesil Caliskan.
Thank you very much, Miss Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Minister for his statement on this really important issue. The continued instability in the region is of growing concern to many of us, not just because of the immense loss of life, but also the security risk that is ever growing for this country. The government has been clearly leading calls for de-escalation in the region. Does the Minister agree that it is time once again to redouble our efforts for those calls so that we can see all parties in the region show restraint?
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Calum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I appreciate your guidance and would like to take the opportunity to apologise to you and to the House. I rise to speak on behalf of my party and in support of the measures laid by the government today. Liberal Democrats have for a long time supported a strengthening of our UK sanctions against the Iranian regime, not least in light of the murder of Mahsa Amini just over 2 years ago. After Mahsa's brutal murder by the Iranian morality police, Iranians took to the streets in their hundreds of thousands. Violence was meted out by the Iranian authorities against those brave individuals. Over 20,000 were detained, with women and girls particularly targeted, and ultimately some were executed by the Iranian authorities. Behaviour such as this is characteristic of the Iranian regime. The FCDO's own Human Rights and Democracy report, in its most recent iteration, labels Iran as one of the worst executors globally. Over 500 people were executed in 2022, including 2 young offenders. The report also identifies continued erosion and systematic violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as freedoms of expressions and freedoms of belief, as well as tightening restrictions against women and girls, and chillingly the use of facial recognition software to identify those deemed to be improperly dressed. And just as the Iranian regime sees fit to violate the basic rights of its own citizens at home, its influence abroad is similarly malign, both in the Middle East as well as even closer to home. It is Iranian drones, over 8,000 of them, that have come to Vladimir Putin's aid, being launched continually into Ukraine since the start of the war. And we supported the strong condemnation by the UK and our E3 partners following the news that Iranian ballistic missiles were also now being exported to Russia for use against our Ukrainian allies. So to that end, we welcome these sanctions today, which extend existing sanctions against UAVs to other goods and technology of strategic concern, from cameras designed for UAVs to microwave amplifiers. We trust that the Minister will keep this list under continual review, not least so as to ensure we are preventing the future supply of anything which Russia might be seeking to procure from the Iranians. And will the Minister take this opportunity to update the House as to what discussions he has had with or his colleagues have had with E3 counterparts and others regarding the status of the JCPOA? What is the government's stance on the JCPOA, given Iran's seeming disregard for international law? Liberal Democrats also urge the government to go further on sanctions. These past few weeks have served as a demonstration of Iran's terrible influence within the Middle East, and in particular, the role of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. We condemn the barrage of ballistic missiles fired by against Israel by Iran's IRGC at the beginning of the month. The IRGC continues to supply rockets and weaponry to its terrorist proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis, who have caused so much death and misery in the Middle East. And in 2022, security services revealed there have been 10 plots organised by the IRGC in that year alone here on British soil, where the intention was to kidnap or kill British nationals or UK residents. The previous Conservative government did not prescribe the IRGC. The new government, indeed the new Foreign Secretary, said in opposition, the IRGC is behaving like a terrorist organisation and must now be prescribed as such. I agree. So will the Minister now take this long overdue step and prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation? Not only will this have a positive impact in the region, but it will also make the Iranian diaspora in the UK more safe and secure. I'm sure that members on all sides of the House have British Iranian constituents who are deeply concerned about the way that the IRGC has been able to operate with limited constraints in this country. We do, of course, welcome any steps forward when it comes to strengthening our sanctions regime against Iran, but we will continue to make the case to the government that the single most effective thing they can do is to prescribe the IRGC. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to turn to two remaining points. First, recalling the case of Nazanin Reghari-Ratcliffe, who is thankfully now back in the UK with her family following the 6 years she spent in prison in Iran. The Labour Party committed in their manifesto to introduce a right to consular assistance in the case of human rights violations, a measure which we support. I raised yesterday the case of British-Egyptian dual national Ala Abdel Fattah, who has been held without consular access in Egypt. Will the Minister update the House as to when this right to consular assistance will be introduced?
Would the right order to give way?
Please.
Thank you ever so much for giving way. On the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, I'd be interested to what difference he thinks prescription would make, but also on the point around consular. Ala Abdel Fattah, the problem there is the Egyptians do not recognise dual nationality, so a right to consular access would make no fundamental difference. I'd be really grateful, having led an inquiry on this, why he thinks a right to consular access would make a fundamental difference in any of these hostage cases.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her interventions. With regards to the prescription of the IRGC, I think we believe that by prescribing this terrorist organisation that runs a state in the region, we would put considerable constraints on the ability of it to operate around the world and prohibit many of its actions, including those in the UK and threats against British citizens to which I referred. I know that the Honourable Lady herself has taken a strong interest in the case which I mentioned, and indeed mentioned it herself in the House yesterday, and I know that she is also working on the denial of access. It seems to me that consular access is a critical role of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and in the case that we are discussing, it is not clear to the family of Abdel Fattah that there has been a sufficient effort by the Foreign Office to make that access in Egypt, and it is in that context that I raise this particular question, but I would still be interested in the Minister's response on the general principle of when this consular assistance will be guaranteed to those who have suffered human rights imprisonment. So secondly, as we use our sanctions regime against those with links to the Iranian regime, we urge the government to look closely to where those individuals and others with links to the regime have stashed their money. Is it the case, like with so many other kleptocratic regimes, that some of that money has been funneled into London? And will the Minister commit to carrying out an audit so we know where these assets are, including those which have been entrusted in the name of family members, and freeze such assets accordingly? I hope the Minister will update the House regarding whether the government is considering any plans for a third piece of economic crime legislation to look at closing loopholes in the previous two acts, including finally delivering a comprehensive approach to the register of beneficial ownership. And finally, my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston and Surbiton, has set out how in this Parliament the Liberal Democrats will act as a constructive opposition. This is my first contribution to debate on legislation as the party's foreign affairs spokesperson, so I want to put on record that this approach applies as much in the international sphere as it does for domestic policy. Only yesterday, we welcomed the government's measures on utilising frozen Russian assets for the benefits of Ukraine, something we had called for many months. But we also urge the government to go further, seizing those assets in their entirety. And so it is in this constructive spirit that I put forward my party's proposals for taking further steps on Iran. In this area too, I urge the new government to be ahead of events, not behind them.
David Pinto-Duschinsky.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for his statement and welcome it. It's welcome both for its steadfast support for the Ukraine and for its action on Iran. As I think we've heard from everyone in the House, Iran poses a threat both to regional and global stability. The Iranian regime is not just exporting weapons to support Russia's despicable illegal war in Ukraine, it is exporting terror. And we've heard mention of the Houthis and various other groups as well. And also, and I thank the honourable member for raising this, it is committing savage repression against its own people. Over 230 people have been executed in Iran in the last few months alone. And I know certainly that the Iranian community in Hendon is incredibly worried about this horrific repression that the Iranian people face. And so, in that spirit, we know Iran faces a threat, and we know that this threat is growing. And given that, I welcome what we're hearing around the cross-party consensus, that these measures make real sense. And all I would say is firstly to thank the Minister for laying them, but also to ask that the FCDO keeps a close eye and keeps close scrutiny on the threat that Iran faces so that we can put further measures on if needed, so that we can back up the government's strong action to make sure we confront the threat of Iran head on. Thank you.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I strongly welcome the contents of this order. As my honourable friend on the front bench and indeed the Minister have made clear, Iran is a malign influence which is fueling many of the most serious conflicts around the world. Obviously, we had the horrendous attack on Israel recently, but also the supply of weapons to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to Houthis, and particularly to Russia in their invasion of Ukraine. We have debated Ukraine many times and will continue to do so, and I know that the Minister has taken a very close interest, and I thank him for his support when in opposition, because both this side and his side of the House are united on support for Ukraine, and this will help a little, but he will know that Ukraine is suffering desperately, that the casualties being inflicted in part by the weapons which hopefully this order will help to stop reaching Russia is horrendous, and stopping those attacks is part of President Zelensky's victory plan, although I absolutely echo the comments of my honourable friend on the front bench that we need to do more to implement and support Ukraine through his victory plan, in particular by allowing Ukraine to not just shoot down attacks from drones and missiles over its own territory, but to attack from where they originate, which is outside of the border of Ukraine in Russia itself. And it isn't just going to be enough to stop the supply of weapons from Iran. We also know they are being supplied by other countries, in particular North Korea, now not just weapons, but potentially by troops as well. And therefore, I hope that we will look at sanctions enforcement across all those countries that are giving succour to Russia. But I do want just to touch on one or two other aspects of Iranian behaviour. He will know that sanctions are used to try and put an economic squeeze on countries that have breached the international rules, but also to uphold human rights. In particular, the use of Magnitsky sanctions has now been well established. He may be aware I also chair in this place the All-Party Media Freedom Group. Iran's record in this area is terrible. They are number 176 out of 180 in terms of the index of press freedom. As RSF, the Reporters Without Borders organisation, have pointed out, more than 100 journalists have been interrogated, detained or imprisoned since the start of the protest movement in 2022. 16 still remain in prison due to their work, with another 19 who were there before. But it is not just within Iran. He will know that the IRGC lie behind the attacks on journalists in London itself. Iran International has had to have protection, has had to move offices because of a continuing threat by the IRGC against its journalists. And I've talked to the management of Iran International and some of their very brave journalists, one of whom, as he knows, was attacked in the streets of London. And it isn't just Iran International. Those members of the BBC Persian service continue to be subject to threats and harassment, and their families in Iran itself are being pressurised by the regime to try and reach those journalists. So for that reason, I echo the calls which have already been made by my honourable friend, by the Liberal Democrat spokesman. The IRGC must be prescribed. That was the view of his colleagues when they sat over on this side. It is the view of America and Canada, and we do wait to hear as soon as possible what decision the government will take. The other aspect is that imposing sanctions is clearly an important part of putting pressure, but they need to be enforced as well. One of the benefits of having professional investigative journalism is that they are sometimes able to expose things which otherwise remain hidden. And if he hasn't done so, would he please study very carefully this week's Economist? The Economist has carried out an in-depth investigation into the enforcement of the sanctions imposed by America on Iran and the way in which they are being completely bypassed. Apparently, Iran is currently selling 1.8 million barrels of oil per day. Almost all end up in China. But the way in which they do that is through a whole host of front organisations. Individual components of the Iranian regime are given crude oil themselves to market, including the IRGC and the Quds force, and they then set up their own front organisations. They then use shadow organisations to procure tanker movements. They have banks which support that, and a large part, as I say, of that ends up in China, who are the main purchasers. But the money flows back through this network directly to Iran. And whilst I don't necessarily believe that this is done knowingly, the Economist also state that London is the world's 6th biggest base by number of Iranian-linked entities who are blacklisted by America. So I hope that he will look carefully, not just at tightening the noose around the regime, but also to making sure that the loopholes which are currently being exploited to get around sanctions are properly closed down in this country and elsewhere. But as I say, today's motion is very welcome, but we need to do a lot more.
Dr. Kieran Mullan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I welcome the opportunity today to not just give my support to the proposal to continue and extend sanctions, but to actually put on record my condemnation of the Iranian regime and give my support to the women and girls of Iran who've been so brave in fighting for their rights in the face of brutal suppression. Sanctions imposed on Iran come as we see increased hostility by groups associated with Iran or Iran itself at an international level. Most recently, there are 2 direct attacks on Israel this year, which the UK and Western allies have condemned as escalatory actions in an already precarious situation, speak volumes to the threat the regime represents. One of the purposes of the UK's sanctions against Iran are to deter the government of Iran or an armed group backed by the government of Iran from conducting hostile activity against the UK or any other country. The removal of sanctions should come only when there is evidence that Iran has disengaged from this hostile activity, and yet all we've seen is the opposite. Since May 2019, Iran has continued to violate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action implemented to limit the Iranian nuclear programme in exchange for sanctions relief. Furthermore, Iran is well known to fund multiple groups designated by the UK as terrorist organisations across the Middle East. These proxies act to destabilise the region as a whole. But Iran's activities are not limited to the Middle East. As we've talked about in the Chamber already, there have been a number of threats to individuals in the UK emanating from Iran, and as the Minister outlined, there is now extensive support for the illegal war in Ukraine, both militarily and logistically, coming from Iran, and that is impacting directly on the lives of brave Ukrainian soldiers seeking to defend their country. And as I said at the start, their terrorist actions sadly extend to their own people. We know that they currently live under a violent, oppressive regime. In September 2022, Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman, was arrested by Iran's morality police for allegedly not complying with the country's Islamic dress code. 3 days later, she tragically died in police custody, sparking a wave of protests across Iran and drawing the attention of the international community. Despite Iranian officials claiming that Mahsa Amini died of natural causes, the widespread protests that followed were a clear response to years of repression, of demonstrators demanding justice, freedom and accountability. The bravery of these protesters cannot be overstated. The Iranian government's heavy-handed response was brutal, with the UN fact-finding mission and Iran Human Rights reporting that over 550 protesters were killed by security forces. These deaths represent the highest death toll seen in any protest since the Islamic Republic's founding in 1979, and it's a stark reminder of the dangers faced by those who dare to voice dissent. Sadly, the plight of women in Iran is not limited to the enforcement of hijab laws, but extends to many aspects of daily life, rooted in systemic discrimination codified in law. The situation becomes even more alarming when we consider the lack of protection against domestic violence. Iran currently has no law to safeguard women from abuse or femicide. Between March 2021 and June 2023, at least 165 women were killed by male family members with honour killings, and that remains an ongoing and disturbing tragedy. I'm also deeply concerned by Iran's treatment of followers of the Baha'i faith, which the UN has referred to as the most egregious forms of repression, persecution and victimisation. In February 2022, Iranian authorities allowed only recognised religions to be stated on the new national ID card. In doing so, they deprived unrecognised religious minorities of access to many basic services. Without the card, Iranian nationals are unable to obtain credit cards, driver's licences, passports, and nor can they buy property, cash, cheques or apply for loans. It's clear evidence of serious discrimination against minority groups. I'm proud that the 78th UN General Assembly under the last government, the UK co-sponsored the Iran Human Rights Resolution, calling for Iran to eliminate in law and in practice all forms of discrimination on the basis of thought, conscience, religion or belief. Whilst a strong message from international partners, it fell on deaf ears. The UK government, alongside allies such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United States, have made its stance clear. In September 24, our Foreign Secretary called on the Iranian government to end human rights abuses and to cease the use of force to impose the hijab. We should continue to press the Iranian regime to respect the rights of its citizens and remain committed to holding them to account for violations through sanctions and international pressure. We must not turn a blind eye to the human rights abuses in Iran. We stand in solidarity with the Iranian people, especially the women and other minority groups who are leading the fight for dignity, equality and justice. Our sanctions regime is an important part of how we stand up for our values and stand up for those victims of the Iranian regime, both in Iran and abroad, and I enthusiastically support the motion today securing their continuation and expansion.
Like all of the members, I rise in support of these important regulations before us today, which of course expand upon existing sanctions to target additional goods and technology related to Iranian military development and Iran's production of unmanned aerial vehicles and missiles. Madam Deputy Speaker, in recent weeks we've all seen not only that Iran has launched yet a further unprecedented missile attack on Israel, which has rightly attracted a universal condemnation, but also that the UK government has announced further aid to Ukraine in its struggle against Russian aggression, which we all know their war effort and breaches of international humanitarian law are supported by the supply of Iranian UAVs and missiles. Now, I agree with those who have already spoken in this debate that in both instances, Iran, through its supply of UAVs and missiles to various states and non-state or terrorist organisations, serve to prolong the war in Ukraine and risk further escalating conflicts in the Middle East. Now, in a speech to the UN Security Council just last month, the Foreign Secretary rightly emphasised the importance of upholding a rules-based international order and especially international humanitarian law. And Madam Deputy Speaker, in both of those respects, we can, I'm sure, all agree that Iran is a destabilising influence both in the region and further afield. And also, as we've heard so eloquently by the Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle, runs a very savage and repressive regime for Iranian civilians. Now, if we hope to see a more peaceful future, we must ensure that all nations adhere to international law and, where necessary, act to ensure such compliance. Sanctions, such as those before us today, therefore, are very important tools the international community can use to apply pressure upon regimes such as Iran's who contravene international law. And I'm particularly pleased that the Minister outlined how the government coordinated these efforts and these sanctions with other international partners such as the European Union, the United States and Japan. For it is clear that if these are to be effective, there needs to be a coordinated effort across the globe. Now, although I acknowledge that the government has previously introduced a separate sanctions regime and financial sanctions to encourage Iran to comply with international human rights law, I do think it's important to draw reference to the long-standing concerns about the state's atrocious human rights record. And in echoing the words of the Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle, we'll all be familiar with the Woman Life Freedom movement and protests which followed the tragic death in custody of Mahsa Amini, who was arrested for improperly wearing her hijab by the Iranian morality police. Now, Amnesty International, including others, have noted grave human rights violations within Iran since these protests, including further suppression of the rights of freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly, and the intensification of the Iranian regime's crackdown on the rights of women and girls. Thousands were subjected to interrogation, arbitrary detention, unjust prosecution and imprisonment for peacefully exercising their human rights, rights that I'm sure we actually take for granted in this country. Now, these are all reasons to why we should take a firm approach to any contravention of international law by the Iranian regime, and I would welcome the assurances from the Minister that the government continues to monitor the effectiveness of sanctions introduced to encourage the Iranian regime to comply with international humanitarian law. Now, in returning to the dreadful consequences of Iran's supply of UAVs and missiles to various states and non-state actors across the world, we should also bear in mind that sanctions can only form part of any strategy. As the United Nations states, sanctions do not operate, succeed or fail in a vacuum. The measures are most effective at maintaining or restoring international peace and security when applied as part of a comprehensive strategy encompassing peacekeeping, peace-building and peacemaking. These sanctions, therefore, must fit into a wider approach that the UK takes towards the situation in the Middle East, where we also support de-escalation and peace-building initiatives as they arise. We must be firm and fair. Where there are opportunities for de-escalation, we must take them, whilst remaining steadfast in our support of international law and preparedness to sanction those states, such as Iran, who act to undermine it.
Richard Foord.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome today's motion to approve Iranian sanctions. It marks an essential and targeted response to Iran's growing military threat. By expanding sanctions to cover these additional goods, this additional technology, particularly those contributing to Iran's UAVs and missiles, we are striking at the core of Iran's military-industrial complex. And this is crucial in disrupting Iran's capability to continue fueling conflicts, not just in the Middle East, but also aiding Russia's war against Ukraine. Russia's recent desperate procurement of weapons from North Korea shows that Russia is struggling. By cutting off Iran's support, we further tighten the pressure on Russia's war machine, limiting the lifeline Iran provides and squeezing their ability to continue the brutal conflict in Ukraine. Since August 2022, Iran has supplied Russia with hundreds of Shahed 136 drones, which have been used extensively to target Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure. Just last month, the US confirmed that Iran had transferred shipments of Fath 360 ballistic missiles to Russia. These missiles, with a range of 75 miles, allow Russian forces to conserve their more advanced long-range missiles for other strategic targets. The Fath 360 missiles will undoubtedly be employed within weeks, which I fear could lead to more civilian casualties in Ukraine. Russia has already deployed Iranian drones to strike critical infrastructure, and the missiles that we're seeing transferred will clearly have a similar role. Dozens of Russian personnel have been trained in Iran to use these systems, deepening the cooperation between these two regimes. Iran has already showed us their character by striking at the heart of the UK, and as we heard from the Right Honourable Member for Maldon, the attack in March on the Iranian journalist Pouria Zarati is a stark reminder of the growing threat posed by the Iranian regime to the UK. Over the past 18 months, Iranian journalists in the UK have been under sustained threat from the IRGC, who have targeted reporters and their families in an attempt to silence critical voices. We cannot allow a regime that silences its critics with violence and fear to intimidate those who seek to expose the truth here in the UK.
I will. Madam Deputy Speaker, I really wanted to be here for this debate, but unfortunately I was in two places and I can only be in one place at the one time, so I apologise for that. Does the Honourable Gentleman, as the Chair of the APPG for Freedom of Religious Belief, I want to put it on record if it can, Madam Deputy Speaker, with your discretion, does the Honourable Gentleman agree that the suppression of human rights, the persecution of Christians, of Shias, of Baha'is, denial of education, denial of jobs, denial of the right to even have a life, is something that puts Iran in one of the 4 top countries in the world where suppression and the right to live is suppressed at such a level like no other place?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Strangford for pointing that out, and he's absolutely right. And not only is there no tolerance whatsoever for alternative views or beliefs, Iran was mentioned in the FCDO Human Rights Report in 2022. And it's on that basis, on the basis of that report, that the Liberal Democrats have for years called for us to withhold arms licences to Iran, most obviously, but also to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So the stance that we have on the export of arms to the region is a long-standing one and is very much in line with the Human Rights Report the FCDO produced in 2022. We need to take stronger action on Iranian assets here within the UK. We call for the wider use of Magnitsky sanctions. We should specifically target the relatives of sanctioned individuals who've transferred wealth to avoid the measures. In the past few weeks, we've witnessed just how easy it is to dodge sanctions on Russian oil. We must cut off those financially supporting Iran from London, blocking their access to the world's second largest financial hub. This will help stop the flow of dirty money and ensure that those who support Iran's military operations, directly or indirectly, are punished. As I draw to a close, I wonder whether, in answering, the Minister might comment in his summing up on whether the government will continue to monitor the export of some of the goods that we're talking about today, and in particular the export of those goods to states that neighbour Iran. We've seen with sanctions that have been imposed on Russia that there has been a subsequent uptick in the level of exports of machine tools, for example, to some of the states that surround Russia, and will the UK monitor that? We stand ready to support any further steps that will limit Iran's capacity to cause harm, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine. In the face of Iran's continued support for Russia's brutal war, these sanctions send a clear message. We must keep up the pressure and not let up until Iran's threats to global security diminish. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank all honourable and right honourable members of the House for their contributions. I thought there were some very important points made, and I want to thank them for their wholehearted support for these regulations. And again, I think it's really important in the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we maintain unity on these measures to tackle these regimes, whether that be Russia or indeed Iran. And very much, as I said earlier, these measures represent a step forward in our capability to restrict Iran's proliferation of advanced conventional weapons, which continue to fuel the conflicts we've been discussing in the Middle East, and of course support Russia in its illegal war in Ukraine. And we are firmly committed to using sanctions to hold the Iranian regime to account for its malign activities in the UK and indeed elsewhere. And I should point out that it's not, of course, just these measures. Continuing on from measures under the previous administration, on the 2nd of September, we sanctioned 4 IRGC Quds Force targets who have a role supporting Iranian proxy actions in Iraq, Syria and Lebanon. We announced sanctions against 15 Iranian and Russian targets on the 10th of September, cancelled our bilateral air service arrangements with Iran Air and targeted those who were involved in a series of actions. We have consistently raised our concerns directly with the Iranian regime and indeed with a range of partners. And of course, on the 14th of October, we designated 9 individuals and entities involved in facilitating Iran's destabilising activity, which included senior military and IRGC figures and entities involved in Iran's ballistic missile programme. And of course, those are just some of the examples since this government came in, but that is part of over 460 Iranian individuals and entities who have been sanctioned due to Iran's malign activities in the region and internationally, and that includes 94 human rights-specific sanctions on individuals and entities responding to many of the very significant and rightful concerns that have been raised by colleagues today. Turning to... I will happily give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. It's quite clear from the tenor of the House, and I have to say as a woman I find it incredibly moving to hear the Honourable Members for Bexhill and Baton, for Ceredigion, speaking so strongly for the women who continue to be raped and blinded by the Iranian regime. It's clear that the House today is saying we want to see more effort on this, so I'd be very grateful if he could commit to taking that away. I won't ask him to predetermine what he will do on sanctions, but it is incredibly powerful to hear so many men speaking up for the Iranian women, and they need to hear our voices or they will lose hope.
I wholeheartedly agree with her comments, and as she knows, we do not comment on future designations, but I've certainly heard the very strong voices across the House today, and they indeed reflect the reality, the horrific reality for women, for girls, indeed ordinary Iranian civilians from that repressive regime. And I thank her overall, Madam Deputy Speaker, for her support. She rightly highlighted a series of Iran's malign actions. I agree with her that those promoting proscribed organisations in the UK should face the full force of the law. Obviously, that's for our law enforcement agencies, but the Prime Minister and others have made that absolutely clear. She did raise concerns about, I think she was referring to the foreign influence registration scheme. I can assure her we remain absolutely committed to that, and we will further strengthen our national security whilst maintaining the UK as an international hub for business, and announcements on the tiers will be made at a later stage. But we are absolutely committed to that. That's not going anywhere. We're committed to moving forward with that agenda, and I've been discussing it with colleagues across government. She and others mentioned the JCPOA. Let me be clear, snapback remains an option. We remain in close contact with E3 and other partners on this, and I will say a little more on that in the moment. I refer her to my previous comments in relation to the IRGC as a whole. In terms of the internationalisation of sanctions she asked me about, and other honourable members asked me about, absolutely this is about working with partners. Are we looking at how we can increase penalties and enforcement? Absolutely, whether that be OFSI or others, but obviously can't comment on future investigations and designations. She asked about wider UK military support to Ukraine. I mean, I would point to the very important announcement yesterday on top of the existing commitments, but that extraordinary revenue accelerator, which is going to deliver 2.26 billion additional to Ukraine for crucial needs, working with our partners across the G7. I will come on to Lebanon in a moment, but would I condemn all the proxies that Iran is supporting? Absolutely. We've been very, very clear about that, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thought the other honourable and right honourable members made important points. My colleagues from Barking, the Lib Dem spokesman from Bicester and Woodstock, rightly referring to the human rights and repressive actions issues within Iran itself. He asked specifically about one case. I know he received a specific answer from the Minister for the Middle East on that yesterday in questions. He asked about the wider issues around illicit finance and kleptocracy. These are significant priorities for the Foreign Secretary and myself, and I can assure him and the House that we are working at pace on these issues, and we'll be announcing further measures in due course. And he asked about PARBOs and ensuring transparency over registered beneficial ownership. I am in close contact, particularly with our overseas territories regarding these issues, and made very clear that we expect to see progress on these those issues at a pace, and I will be making that very clear to leaders when they join me for the Joint Ministerial Council in a few weeks' time. My honourable friend from Hendon rightly pointed out the heinous executions and internal repression. As I said, though, I won't comment on further designations. The honourable member from Maldon, thank him for his kind remarks about the cross-party support that we've all had for Ukraine. He rightly raised the issues relating to the DPRK, and he'll have heard what the Foreign Secretary said with his counterpart in the Republic of Korea just in recent days. Our absolute condemnation on these reports regarding DPRK's involvement in Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. I will certainly take a look at the Economist article that he mentioned. We will seek to do everything we can to close down loopholes and ensure the effectiveness of our regime. Honourable gentleman from Bexhill and Battle, I thought gave some very, very powerful points, particularly again highlighting that impact on women and girls and also minority groups, touched on by my honourable friend from Stamford as well, within Iran. And this government remains absolutely committed to freedom of religion or belief, and targeting or repressive actions against religious minorities cannot be tolerated. My honourable friend from Ceredigion, Preseli, again also highlighted the internal repression, and the honourable gentleman from Honiton and Sidmouth ranged a whole series of issues, but also particularly spoke about third country circumvention. And this is an issue that's a key priority for the government. It's one that forms a regular part of my conversations with third countries identified. I've had numerous such conversations, Madam Deputy Speaker, in recent weeks, and will continue to do so, and also indeed with our allies. We must close down all the loopholes and all the routes that, whether it's Russia or Iran, make sure that our sanctions regimes are effective. Let me just briefly touch on a couple of specific themes that came out before concluding, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me be clear, Iran's actions in relation to Israel completely unacceptable. The Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary have been absolutely clear. We stand with Israel and recognise their right to self-defence in the face of Iranian aggression, utterly condemn in the strongest terms their attack against Israel, and we designated individuals specifically in response to the attack on Israel, and that included senior military figures and entities involved in Iran's ballistic missile programme. I referred to the JCPOA, but let me be clear, Iran's nuclear escalation since 2019 has gone far beyond JCPOA limits and is undermining the deal. And alongside our E3 partners, we will use all diplomatic options available to ensure Iran never develops a nuclear weapon, including triggering the snapback of all UN sanctions lifted under the JCPOA if necessary. I mentioned the actions that we've taken against regional proxies, but I just remind the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the UK prescribes the entirety of Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation and has an asset freeze in place against the entire organisation. We assess Hamas in its entirety to be concerned with terrorism and therefore has prescribed the organisation in full. And the Houthis are sanctioned in their entirety by the UK and are subject to a targeted arms embargo. I mentioned human rights. As I said, 94 human rights sanctions, Madam Deputy Speaker, on Iranian individuals and entities. The horrifically high rate of executions is a deliberate attempt to instill fear and stifle dissent in Iran, and we remain as a government opposed to the death penalty in all circumstances as a matter of principle. And that situation for women and girls is truly horrific, and we condemn Iran's appalling treatment of women and girls, including through its repressive policies, and will work with international partners to engage with the findings of the UN Special Rapporteur on Iranian human rights. And media freedoms were also mentioned, and as a member of the Media Freedom Coalition, we are determined to ensure that journalists are able to do their jobs without fear of retribution. The situation for detainees, the historical cases involving Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and others, we continue to believe that British nationals and British-Iranian dual nationals are at significant risk of detention in Iran, and British nationals are advised not to travel to Iran, but we do not and never will accept our nationals being used as diplomatic leverage. And in concluding, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will briefly, before I conclude,
one of the things, and again I apologise for not being here earlier on to ask this question directly to the Minister, the IRGC are quite clearly the leader of Iran's private army. They're involved in some of the worst oppression, murders, despicable acts across all of Iran. Is it not time to collate all this information and put it together to hold them people accountable for what they're doing in relation to human rights abuses in Iran?
And for his question, I made clear our position on the IRGC earlier on, but as I pointed out, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have sanctioned directly a number of individuals involved with that organisation, and we recognise the threat that they pose and will take the necessary measures to counter it at home and around the world, but we obviously do not comment on future designations. Lastly, I just wanted to, because it's been raised on a number of occasions, Madam Deputy Speaker, the safety and security of the United Kingdom from Iran's malign actions. And it was quite rightly pointed out that the UK has identified at least 15 threats towards UK-based individuals. And whilst our police, intelligence and security agencies have been confronting these threats for many years, their seriousness has increased in recent months. Let me be clear, we will always stand up to threats from foreign nations, and we will continue to work closely with our international partners to identify, deter and respond to those threats. Lastly, on Lebanon, we've been very clear a political solution consistent with Resolution 1701 is the only way to restore the sovereignty, territorial integrity and stability of Lebanon. We have been calling for the implementation of an immediate ceasefire between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel, and a political plan that will enable civilians on both sides to return to their homes. Nobody wants to see further escalation, and we will continue to work with partners across the region on that, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I want to conclude by saying these new regulations will increase the pressure on Iran's defence industry. They will disrupt Iran's production of UAVs and missiles that could be supplied to proxies in the Middle East or Russia. We'll continue to work with like-minded partners, and these regulations send a clear message to the government of Iran and those seeking to harm the UK's security and that of our partners. We will not stand idle in the face of this aggression, and I commend these regulations to the House.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.